The rings of the fifth planet of the star Debilis, called Debilis 5, contained many tiny moons, some just 100 kilometers in diameter. But these moons proved to be some of the most profitable mining sites in the entire known galaxy. The star Debilis had a rhythm of periodic novas which would create some unique heavy metal compounds in great abundance. The tiny dust particles and small rocks that made up the rings were useless to try to gather. It had been tried many times. But these larger rocks, some called them tiny moons, were just big enough to plant a mining site on it and slowly turn the entire moon into Swiss cheese. One of the larger moons, nicknamed Bovine for it proved to be a real cash cow to the mining company, was so rich in metals that the mining company locked an entire pre-constructed town onto the surface with electromagnets. That building site, the residential blocks, the science center, the mining operations block, and the storage facilities, which were considerable, weren't going anywhere, even if the star went into nova again and all the rings were blown into the far reaches of the system. This was locked in place. The site had become so profitable that the Empire decided to station a monitor there, with about maybe a dozen troopers at the facility to keep an eye on the ore and the transports. If the rebellion could get a hold of a shipment of that ore, they could generate enough income for hundreds of additional starfighters, or even a Carillion cruiser. Piracy was a big concern, since the Empire seemed to have the rebellion on the run. The procurator, Edwis Mazah, known on Bovine as the Maz, considered himself the local sheriff, with a posse of deputies, his loyal troopers. Unfortunately, his dozen troopers had turned into 8, which he divided into 2 8-hour shifts of 3 men each, with 2 on the overnight watch. The overnight watch consisted of simply manning the control center and the automated monitors. If something did arise, one of them could go investigate while the others stayed safely locked inside the control center. During the day, 2 would patrol and 1 always in the control center. Lately, though, this routine had to be scrapped. Sometimes he was lucky to just get 2 healthy men on duty for a 12-hour shift. There had been some sort of infection spreading through the mining facility. Nobody could really say where it had come from or when it had started. Maz had flown off-site with 2 of his ailing troopers. 2 more had recently perished under very mysterious circumstances. Maz suspected perhaps the rebellion had infiltrated the mining facility and begun to infect key personnel, including his troopers, with some kind of biological agent. This is why he's going back to the regional headquarters with blood samples, the bodies of his 2 fallen troopers, and 2 ailing troopers. One of them died en route. When he arrived at the regional headquarters 2 days later, he was alarmed to see his ship met with a team of biological research specialists entombed inside protective plastic suits. He and his men, his whole ship in fact, was quarantined. It was not an unpleasant experience. They had good bunks, they had fine food, they had entertainment on the wall monitors, and plenty of time to catch up on sleep. His trooper recovered quickly. 3 days later, he was released and taken to a briefing. The room was sort of an on-site classroom, he thought, judging from the desks and the orientation of the seats circling around a central podium and table. The briefing was by hologram, though, and obviously it was pre-recorded. The virus that killed his troopers was not an artificial poison. It was unlikely the rebel technology could have produced a viral strain such as this. It resembled the flu in symptoms, but the DNA sequences were totally unique. The researchers at the central facility needed more blood samples. This was a very interesting virus that could prove useful in their weapons program. His recovered trooper had given them antibodies that would serve as a temporary vaccine. In 2 more days, his troopers would be augmented by an additional 20 that he would take back with him, perhaps more, all prepped with the vaccine that they were producing now, and additional vaccine doses would be given to him to give to the miners, if they so wished to receive them. Maz was thrilled. At last he could be in charge of a real detachment and arrange for proper patrols and investigations of practices he'd witnessed which made him suspect that some of the ore was being diverted, some of the income was unaccounted for, and corruption might be spreading throughout the mine. Where there was a lot of money, there tended to be corruption, and wherever there was corruption, the rebellion often followed. Maz knew the maxim. He could begin to take a hard line with the additional men. All he needed was 20 more. But he might be taking back 30. It was like waiting for Christmas. On his last night at the base station, he decided to purchase a couple of the Vermilion girls for he and his trooper. He and his trooper removed their uniforms and dressed in civilian style and went to the entertainment quadrant of the base. They enjoyed the turban beef and drank turban ale, although the turban system was farther away than their own mining facility, but the food and drink had become kind of a theme at the base. The base had been located at the turban system originally. The Vermilion girls arrived and began their song and dance routine, but before they could pull out their harps and begin the instrumental portion of the entertainment, Maz noticed his trooper was turning very pale and sweating. He excused himself, but Maz was distressed to see he did not make it to the private facility room in time. He collapsed and began to have tremors like a seizure. He began to vomit a heavy black vomit through his mouth and nose. He was trying to apologize as Maz began to approach him, but security personnel rushed to the scene and quickly isolated the trooper from any contact with Maz or anyone else. A stretcher arrived and he was sealed inside of it. Maz wasn't even able to speak to him much. The biological research guys were on site in an alarmingly short amount of time, sampling the vomit. Needless to say, Maz was unable to enjoy the full performance of the Vermilion girls that evening. He never saw his old trooper again. In the morning, he met his new squad of troopers. He'd been promised 20, but 26 were on site, standing at attention next to his ship. There were 3 sergeants also. He gave them a quick briefing and told the 3 sergeants he would brief them more during the flight. His briefing didn't really amount to much. He wanted to know how much the sergeants had been taught about corporate fraud and illegal smuggling. What did they know about tapping? Tapping was the practice of separating the more valuable ore and replacing the missing weight with ore of significantly less value, keeping and shipping off the most valuable portions with trash or waste shipments, and pocketing the profits. There was also the habit of keeping separate books, tallies of numbers dealing with costs and income in one book, while keeping a totally different set of numbers for official purposes, one that did not disclose the amounts that the administrators were separating for their own purposes. Oftentimes, these separate funds guided one directly to the rebellion. Maz had learned all this through years of experience. He had 2 whole days to teach the sergeants while in flight what to watch for, tricks he had learned. As they were docking at the mining facility, Maz received an urgent dispatch from the regional headquarters. He looked out the window and watched the troopers disembarking. He thought about calling back one of the sergeants, but he decided to receive the dispatch alone. His trooper had caused an outbreak of an unknown illness throughout the facility. Maz thought he could hear combat in the background during the dispatch. Apparently the virus had a hidden effect. The survivor of the virus would become a carrier of a kind of a secondary illness, which had characteristics of a type of rabies and an alarmingly short incubation time. The symptoms were foaming at the mouth and nostrils associated with bloody vomitus. A savage, raging temper followed, incredible speed and strength, and complete failure of the upper cognitive functions. The man was turned into a savage beast, destroying anyone and anything in its path for hours before he would collapse. Maz was to use his troopers to immediately turn the mining facility into lockdown. Any symptoms were to be immediately quarantined. The trooper's armored suit should provide adequate protection against most of the contagions. Maz was to keep in contact with the regional headquarters, or else, if contact should be broken, the mining facility was to be cleansed. Maz knew what that meant. All living beings exterminated, the moon scrubbed, as it were, and a whole new facility dropped down and attached electromagnetically, probably in as little as a week. Maz went to go call on the sergeants to brief them on what he'd just learned. As he stepped off the transport into the docking facility, he was a little alarmed to see 3 of his new troopers on their knees vomiting. Several of the other troopers were around these 3, teasing them for being so space-sick. One of the sergeants walked up to him and stopped, took off his helmet, and began to speak. Sir, He then began to flush red. His hands came up and began to claw at his throat as he dropped to his knees. He began to shake violently and fell to the ground in a seizure and began to vomit, thick black vomit. He then uttered a strange grunt and growl, and slowly his face turned and looked back up at Maz. His eyes had turned red. Maz heard the sound of struggling and shouting. He looked past the sergeant. His 3 vomiting troopers were savagely attacking the other troopers, biting, clawing, tearing at them. Blasters began to sound off, starting with Maz's own as he put down the sergeant in front of him like a rabid dog. Another sergeant was in front of him, asking him questions. What was it that just happened? What was that urgent dispatch? But Maz ignored him for the time being. Maz looked around and turned to the sergeant. Sergeant, where is everyone? The pilots, the ground crew, the docking administrator, the cargo handlers, all of these had been standing around just a few moments ago. All of his troopers, everyone had vanished. He heard a window breaking. He heard shouting down the hallway. Grab your blaster and set to the highest setting, Sergeant, he shouted as he ran into the facility. Black vomit seemed to be everywhere.